Hi, thank you for joining me for a look at Paul Hindemith's Sonata Opus 25, number 1 for solo viola. This sonata was written in 1922 between the two world wars. Paul Hindemith served in the military for Germany in World War I and was shocked and horrified by what he had seen. He decided to reflect that in his music, and he developed a style called New Objectivity, in which he endeavored to try to expand the expressive possibilities in music and abandon the more sentimental and overtly melodic elements that were popular in music prior to the war. This sonata certainly exemplifies that new objectivity style. It's in 5 movements. The first and second movements are played together, attacca, and the first movement begins with this very strong and important 3-note or 3-chord motif. He has us play it twice at the very beginning just to make sure that the listener really grasps that this is a very important motif that he's introducing. He repeats this throughout the first movement. And one thing that I like to think about in this first movement is to make sure that each time he has this 3-note motif, it really stands alone, almost like an island amidst all the other musical material that's happening around it. Towards the end of the movement, he breaks down this 3-note motif, and I like to be able to play the end of this piece where each time in between this motif, we get a little bit more relaxed with the tempo and a little bit more resigned with the expression. And then finally, we go straight in to the second movement. The second movement really is Paul Hindemith's reaction against the militarization that he saw happening in Germany, particularly before and during World War I. The outer sections, it's in 3 parts. The outer sections are a type of march. And this march is a little bit dark, a little bit sardonic, but it still has that strict sense of rhythm that a march has. One thing I find helpful for these outer 2 sections, the march sections, are to try to keep the rhythm quite tight. And I like to make sure that the dotted 8th, 16th figure is almost double dotted, and that the accents that occur are really brought out and very strictly in time. The middle section in between these 2 march sections is much more flowing, and while I feel that it should have still a regular sense of time, we can have a little bit more sense of freedom in the rhythm here, and we can have a little bit more sense of freedom in terms of the sound. I like a rather light sound in this section. I keep the bow very, very light on the string so that it has a very, very markedly different feel, both in color and in sound, to the outer sections of this movement. The third movement is marked slow. This is probably the slowest and most contemplative movement of this sonata. One thing that I find helpful in this movement is to try to really bring out the extremes of the dynamics that Hindemith is demonstrating with this movement. He has many phrases that end with these fermatas throughout this movement, and these can really create a sense that we have these standalone phrases, particularly in the lower regions of the dynamic range. I would make sure also that when he gets in the dynamic of pianissimo or pianissimo, that we really explore how lightly we can play, almost poetic in the way that we phrase those little fragments that end with the fermatas. The fourth movement is probably the most well-known of this sonata, and it's marked as being frenzied and wild with a tempo that is 600 to the quarter note, and he expressly says that tone quality is secondary. So now's our chance to just go for it. You could say that this movement could be the Fast and the Furious, ideally with fewer crashes happening. This movement, the thing to really think about here would be maximizing the intensity of our expression and maximizing the dynamic. You really need to go for it in this one, not to worry too much about your sound, and just to really go for this incredibly intense feeling with this movement. Some things that I find helpful in this movement are the notes that are not drone notes. I like to mark very clearly which direction the bow goes, which may seem rather simple, but when you're playing it so fast, it really helps to have those as signposts along the way to make sure that we don't get kind of bungled up with our bow and what's happening. The second thing that I find very helpful is that when I'm practicing this movement, I really try about 95% of the time to play quite a bit under tempo and about mezzo forte. Maybe once a day, I'll play it up to tempo and up to the dynamic that's marked. Otherwise, if we try to play it that way all the time, you'll quickly find that your bow arm gets incredibly tired. So make sure that you pace yourself in the preparation of this movement. And finally, the fifth movement is probably the most overtly lyrical and expressive movement. It's also slow, similar to the third movement. You could say that these two movements, the third movement and the fifth movement, are bookends to this wild and frenzied fourth movement. But while the third movement is more focused on these extremes of dynamics and fragmentary phrases, this movement is a little bit more sung throughout, and I think is his most melodic movement of this sonata. And it's quite beautiful, and feel free to really sing out in the passages where he kind of let loose. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of Hindemith's Sonata Opus 25, number 1 for solo viola. Thank you so much for listening.